Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for March 20th, 2024. I have to say the pace of events is breathtaking as we head toward elections in the U.S., elections in countries in Europe. Decisions have to be made on budget and other matters, and we're seeing the continued effect of the all-out offensive from the pro-war establishment to put pressure on governments and elected officials to continue the wars. I want to review some of these developments from the standpoint of ominous signs of capitulation coming from House Republicans in reference to the push for more funding for Ukraine and Israel. Now, after months of successfully blocking Biden's $60 billion plus war package for Ukraine, which is something that the deep state establishment is demanding be passed, it looks as though there is weakening on the side of the Republicans, including the pro-Trump Republicans who have been opposing this. There's been a relentless push from the mainstream media, from think tanks, from the top officials of the Uniparty, the pro-war party, and now we're beginning to see some signs of buckling. There's a deadline of March 22nd for the general budget, and this is the focus of the next couple of days in Congress. And then there's an Easter recess, and they'll return on April 9th. Now, it's expected that they'll take up the supplemental funding bill at that time on Ukraine and Israel funding. Now, the Democrats want to have the two linked together, but there's an effort now from Speaker Mike Johnson, and it's been an ongoing effort to separate them. But there's an offensive led by Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries and former Speaker Nancy Pelosi to force the issue of the funding as a whole package. And of course, Biden's State of the Union address centered around the idea that not bowing down to Putin, the barbaric dictator, as Biden and others have been calling him, that means you cannot let the Congress withhold the funds for Ukraine. Now, the corporate-funded think tanks like the Atlantic Council have been extremely vocal on this, with one session after another, lobbying, bringing in leaders from Eastern Europe, and so on. Now, what Speaker Mike Johnson said is that he's still considering the idea of separating the funding bill for Israel, because he knows that has support in both parties, from Ukraine, and introduce them as standalone bills. Now, on the Ukraine side of things, what is hypocritical here is the linking of funding for Ukraine, the $60+ billion package, to more funds to protect the U.S. border, as if giving the Neocon warhawks what they want in return for funding enhanced border security. How is that standing up against the deep state military industrial financial complex? You're still voting for war. The idea that you're getting something for it avoids the whole question of, is there a principle involved? Will Republicans stand up against the warhawks who are committed to permanent warfare and therefore permanent funding at ever higher levels of the war machine? This is nothing but an end around for those who oppose Ukraine funding, who recognize that the war is lost and that the war in Ukraine has nothing to do with U.S. national security, that it's nothing but capitulation to the deep state unipolar order and its permanent war strategy. On the question of Israel, there's support from both parties for the continuation of a brutal, murderous attack on the Palestinian population, as the idea that by mass killing, you'll somehow get enough Hamas members to make it worthwhile. Now, can't Republicans see this as part of the same deep state effort to continue the buildup of the unipolar order, which is collapsing, and that is being done on behalf of the corporate cartels? Now, obviously not. And while Trump remains firm on his opposition to funding of the Ukraine war, he's still supporting Biden, essentially supporting Biden in calling for defense of Israel and a massive funding effort, $14 billion on top of $4 billion annual expenditures to continue to fund the operation in Israel. Now, while this debate is playing out in the United States, the global unipolar order strategy of permanent warfare is consolidating its hold in Europe. This week, there was a meeting of the Germans, French, and Polish leaders. The defense ministers of Poland and Germany met and adopted a proposal for a rapid reaction force for defense of Eastern Europe from a Russian invasion, an invasion which is not about to happen. And if it did happen, their call for 5,000 troops to stop the Russians is pathetic. It wouldn't work. They announced they expect support for this as well from the United Kingdom, Sweden, and Italy. And the German Defense Minister Pistorius is continuing to say that Germany must become war ready, including adopting a policy of trying to convince German school children that the military is good and that war may be necessary. This was also the theme of the discussion recently of the European Union Council, whose president, Charles Michel, said that in order to be war ready, Europe must shift to a, quote, war economy, unquote. This means stepping up military manufacturing, which means you have to have funding to support the war industries. This is nothing but a raw bailout of collapsing European companies that are collapsing because of the combination of green policy, sanctions, and war. The idea that Michel put forward is an echo of the line from George Orwell's 1984. Michel said, quote, "If we want peace, we must prepare for war," unquote. And there's a continuing freakout, especially in the United States and the United Kingdom, over Putin's victory in Russia's elections. Now, an indication of the hypocrisy behind this permanent war party was given to us by the lamentable neocon, Senator Lindsey Graham, the Republican from South Carolina, who reversed himself on Ukraine's so-called democracy. Last August in Kyiv, he said, Ukraine must hold, quote, free and fair elections, even while it's under attack, unquote. That's what Lindsey Graham said, 8 months ago. Now, yesterday in Kyiv, after meeting with Zelensky, he said, well, elections should come after a successful war effort. In other words, war and martial law and suppression of opposition in Ukraine must continue for the war effort to be successful. In other words, permanent war. This is just what the corporate cartel officials of the military-industrial financial complex have ordered. And Graham is nothing if he's not an apostle of the preservation of that order. So here you see the line coming from the war hawks, the neocons, the supporters of so-called liberal democracy, which is that war is necessary and the funding for that must come out of other programs, including education, healthcare, infrastructure, and that what is spent on infrastructure has to go into the green policy. So the totally wrong economic approach is directly connected to the permanent war strategy. I'm going to be discussing that today with Helga Zepp-LaRouche on our weekly dialogue. I'll have a link to that in the description section, and I'll also have a link to my new article on the Biden State of the Union address. So join us later today when I talk with Mrs. LaRouche as we discuss the implications of the NATO reaction to Putin's election.